So, but in the absence of, I think, a higher purpose that a lot of people don't feel, why would people be motivated to get married? If people are thinking, well, it's just because, oh, I get a tax break, or maybe my children should have a, well, it's better if there's a contract involved. And I'm not saying those marriages don't work or that people aren't loyal and committed and loving and so on, but there is a qualitative difference between a religious marriage ceremony, and a secular civil marriage.
So, Nina Power, writer, philosopher, it's a real joy to welcome you to the Coalition for Marriage. For anyone who's joining who doesn't know, we're the UK's largest pro marriage organisation, representing tens of thousands of individuals from all faiths and none, all political backgrounds, who just think that man woman marriage is something special, something unique, something to be celebrated. And that's not for a minute to say other things don't take place in society. They clearly do, but we think that the unique contribution of man woman marriage really, really should be recognised for what it is and what it does, and all the social science agrees, etc., etc., etc. You've heard me say that so many times. Nina, it's a real joy to talk to you, because there's this whole issue about marriage declining in society and what does it mean, and the fact that, well, women don't need men anymore because they don't need the money, they can work, the whole kind of dating thing, well, they can just go and find somebody on an app, etc., etc., etc. But you've written a very interesting intervention in the whole conversation, and I think it was published paperback April 2023, I
Yeah.
think. So recent book. It's had some really good responses to it. What do men want? Well, let's start off, before we get to the answer. What on earth made you ask such an interesting question?
Well, perhaps before we even get to that, I want to maybe state my own personal position vis-a-vis marriage, because it's probably a bit interesting and maybe we can come back to it, which is that I am married, but I'm only very recently married in my mid 40s, and I was planning not to get married. So maybe we can talk about some of those reasons, because I think my journey, if you like, from being a kind of leftist, liberal, secular subject to being a Christian, might be interesting on this topic of marriage. But
100%.
so,
Yeah.
but just to say, I fully support your project, and I agree with you about the social science literature, the secondary literature on marriage. Everything I've read and reviewed, and I've reviewed quite a few books about this, does point indeed to the superiority of two-parent marriage, and the longevity of marriage for the benefit of children, and all of those sorts of things. So I think that heterosexual marriage is the superior option. It is better for everybody, but we can get into that maybe. But so, what do men want? Well, it was partly a response to, I'm sure you'll all recall, the kind of increasing attacks on men qua class, right? So there's sort of entire attacks on men as a sex, which were starting to appear, I think, around sort of the early 2010s, maybe, hit a peak sort of mid 2010, so 2013, 14, 15, but then all the way through. So we had various iterations of this, discussions around toxic masculinity, the whole Me Too movement, um, the idea that men, and particularly white men, were somehow to blame, or had been the beneficiaries of certain kinds of privilege to which they shouldn't have had, and there was a resurrection of the use of the word patriarchy, very often misused word, in fact completely misunderstood word in the context, um, and and as somebody who indeed finds a lot very interesting in second wave feminism, where I think some of these questions were posed in a much more serious philosophical and political way, which is not to say I agree with all of the conclusions of the second wave, just that there was, a moment where women's history and all of those things was taken very seriously, following on from early 20th century moves. What we saw was a kind of a sort of grotesque parody of the I suppose the stereotypes of the man-hating feminist, which I would say never really existed in the second wave, but somehow was created as this sort of trope, or this position more recently. And so you'd had all these endless attacks on men. I thought given my real life experience and my relation and the love that I have for my father, my brother, my husband, my male friends, men I've worked with, and so on, I just thought, well, A, this isn't true, right? This demonization of men is simply not true, and as such must be confronted and combated on that front. And second of all, I wanted to look a bit more in detail about how this was playing out online, because a lot of our life now is sort of structured through these online discussions, and some of these ideas are playing out there. So I went through some of the more extreme, supposedly, aspects of this movement, which are very small. So men going their own way, the idea that there are some men who are simply breaking with the male-female relation altogether and becoming kind of separatists. And I wanted to think about this in relation to uh, separatism in the second wave and see if there are any parallels. Again, these are very minoritarian movements. Um, Discussion of incels, the idea that young men who had not yet married or had a girlfriend were somehow uniquely dangerous to society. We saw a resurrection of this with the recent show Adolescence, and the idea that young men are being kind of manipulated by people, figures like Andrew Tate online, and that this is making them dangerous and misogynistic and so on. And I wanted to basically give a kind of complementarian position, but not make it kind of really explicitly Christian. What I wanted to say was actually, look, that men and women exist and they're different, which already was quite hard to get through. And I published with Penguin, despite the best efforts of my detractors who tried to get it cancelled. It's a very moderate book, I must say. I think a lot of what I said shouldn't need to be restated, but we were at this point. So I basically say, look, men and women are different, and our and our relation to one another is very beautiful, and our difference and our relating in our difference is kind of, one of the most beautiful experiences we can have. And that can be as friends, it can be as husband and wife, it can be as all these different things. So I was basically defending not only men from these sort of grotesque and inaccurate sort of condemnations, but also ultimately defending the way in which men and women do live together, do love each other, do work together, do marry and have children, and so on, and say, well, actually, look, this is a wonderful thing, and that
Yeah.
we should be, it's not always easy, but that anything good is
Yeah.
difficult, and maybe we'll come back to this point you're making, because I think something has shifted since the publication of that book, even, which is even more kind of large scale segregation, right? The idea that neither women nor men need each other, and we're seeing this more and more.
I mean, we can go on to it because even not only neither do men and women need each other, but neither are the concepts of men and women relevant anymore, which is quite remarkable. But what you didn't touch on in the book, and I'm wondering if you can comment, is the kind of, because you say, well, look, of course there are some men who do demonstrate toxic masculinity, a very small number, and you go on about the small groups of this and that. Yeah, absolutely right. But then these things are kind of almost exaggerated as to represent the norm, which you point out they certainly do not. So what do you think is behind the motives of those intelligent people who know that the exaggerations they're making aren't accurate? Why are they doing it?
Well, it's a very, we can ask this question in lots of realms. Who benefits and why, and why this divisiveness, why this division? I mean, I do think um there is a kind of resentment, which is very easy to tap into, and you can basically hook this onto almost anything. So it seemed like at this point it was men's turn to get the resentful treatment, and sometimes it's women's turns, and sometimes it's other groups. But it's often Christians as well. And I mean, we both sit on a panel that looks at the treatment of Christians in public life and employment. And I think a lot of this is downstream. Oh, well, we could talk about the Reformation, but definitely downstream of the sexual revolution, um, and the way in which, yeah, that various things have been detached from one another. So sex from its consequences, sex the act, I mean, and then sexual difference has been, as you say, to even restate sexual difference. I mean, the opening line of my book is simply says men and women exist. right?
Yeah.
And even to state that, keep that line in the book was really difficult. I had to argue with my editors to keep that,
Mm.
like, can you believe it? I mean,
Yeah.
to assert something so banal and so basic. But I agree. So at the same time, we had this
Well,
coming.
you beat the Supreme Court to it. Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, but and I've obviously, like many people in public life or micro public life, have experienced all kinds of attacks on me, on me, as many women have, especially, but also men, Graham Linehan and others, for defending reality, that sexual difference exists and is real and is meaningful and has consequences for political and public social life. It shouldn't be controversial. Um, in any case, so yeah, so to restate that and to say, well, look, things follow from that. Okay, we may be equal in some ways, formally speaking, but we're different. And I mean, I personally think that Christianity is the only major religion that takes male and female equality seriously. I think all of the others mistreat women, men, women, and children. I would say for Christianity, it's the only religion that understands a certain kind of spiritual equality, which has real world effects. And I've come to this conclusion after a long time of thinking about it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and you could argue, in fact, I mean, we have people from all faiths and none. A majority of our supporters, I would say, are probably Christians, but you could argue that Jesus was, in fact, the greatest feminist ever, in the sense of the way he behaved towards women, actively, completely against the culture of the day, etc., etc. So yeah, your words are very much supported. So in terms of the book, I mean, you could also, having read it a couple of times, I think you could also have called it "What Does Society Want from Men?" Because actually, some of the things you raise as to the things that men in their roles, they die in their jobs 10 times as much as women, at least. And they do the sorts of things that require, well, whether they require or not, it ends up being occupied by men, and men end up doing it. And you look at the differences in terms of the prison population, all sorts of other things. There's objective differences in terms of life experience for men and women, and that has an implication on society. And I think you draw that out really, really well. Is there anything else you'd want to pull out from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense of disposability of men, that our society, and it's complicated because a lot of this is downstream of various technological and economic changes in the economy, in how we work, how we live, which actually is paradoxically a consequence of male innovation. Women don't tend to invent many things, but what men have created largely is a world in which women actually do really well, because the economy and technology has become really quite socialized, really quite symbolic, really verbal, really relational, all those things that women tend to be quite good at. We've dispensed with a lot of the physical manual work, but as you say, men still, of course, dominate the most dangerous jobs, and indeed, also, I wrote a chapter about male suicide, which I thought was really
Yep.
important because,
Yep.
not only personally have I lost three male friends to suicide,
Oh
um,
dear.
but it is a really worrying and urgent problem. And this loss of, I think in many cases, though suicide is very complicated, but this loss of a role, the loss of meaning, the loss of a felt purpose, particularly for men now entering into middle age, is really bad. It's absolutely awful.
And it is, and it's awful, and it's rarely mentioned. If I'm honest, it's rarely mentioned, but it's very, very significant. And that whole aspect of meaning, which maybe we can come on to when we look at your answers. Well, what do men actually want in that case? But you're quite right. That whole sense of men in society, men's value, again, what it means. I think when there's a man and a woman working on a spreadsheet in an office on laptops, you might not notice much of a significant difference. But then when you look in wider society, I mean, we've had the example of, I can't remember what they're called, Lily Phillips and some Bonnie Blue, I think it is, who are competing to see how many men they could sleep with in one day. Well, if a man tried to do that, I mean, there's so many implications of that conversation, but a man would never find 1,000 women lining up. It just doesn't work that way. If a woman wanted to go and find somebody on a dating app to hook up with tonight, she could do that very, very easily. Men, not so much. Maybe the top tier of men, yes. But hence you get the notion of incels, which you go into in the book. So there are fundamental differences, and even to the degree that women set the price for sex. Whether that be a swipe on a dating app or whether that be the promise of long-term commitments. Men will pay what they need to pay, and if it's nothing much, and that doesn't put the blame on women for the sex culture that we live in, etc., etc. But it just goes to your point that actually there are just intrinsic differences which aren't socially constructed.
No, exactly. I mean, I think the culture has debased both men and women, and there are lots of reasons why that's happened. But I don't think it is working well for either. I do not think an economy of sex that operates in this way is sustainable or helps people to flourish. I think it creates all kinds of perverse incentives, and it's just like very depressing, honestly.
Well, we could go off down a Louise Perry line
Yeah,
there
and
because
I'm
yeah,
very
she
close to
brings it up
Louise,
around. Yeah,
as
yeah,
a friend, and
yeah,
I very much admire her work, and I think, yeah,
yeah,
I absolutely
yeah,
recommend
yeah.
Louise's work.
So can we look at some of the solutions that you've come up with because again, you touch on some really interesting things in the book. Tell us, what do men want?
Well, I mean, the title is a provocation and a joke, right? It's a reference to Sigmund Freud's
Yeah, yeah,
famous line, what do women want?
yeah,
He doesn't really know, he can't really work it
yeah,
out.
yeah,
So I that was a bit of a sort
yeah,
of joke in
yeah.
a way as a title. Um, but yeah, I mean, I suppose it's some of the things that men want are some of the things that everybody wants, which would be
Mm, mm.
forms of love and recognition and relationality and so on. And I think, the changes we've seen since the book has come out, as you said, hinted at, was this even more separation. I mean, I believe in countries like South Korea, which has like the lowest birth rate now, that men and women are often living in very quite segregated ways, for most of their lives. We're almost entering into kind of large scale secular monasteries and nunneries, right? What is going on here? I mean, this is all happening alongside the demographic crisis and the bottleneck, and people have all kinds of opinions about whether this is necessary, a good thing or a bad thing. I do think the future is going to belong to people who are more religious, and I think that is a good thing. I think the people who are above replacement rate tend to be very devout, as far as I understand it. And this is very interesting to think
It
about
is
what
interesting.
that's going to mean for the
Yeah,
future.
yeah.
But in any case, the sort of average liberal subject who is highly individuated, who is highly, I suppose, programmed to want material things, um, to embrace fleeting pleasures, which are made more and more possible by forms of contraception, and that's been the case for a long time. Um, or at least in principle, and to avoid consequences. And in the absence really of any higher meaning, because I mean, if one marries in a church in the eyes of God, you are also making a covenant with God, not just with the other person. And this takes it out of the realm of the everyday agreement or contract. It's a different order of relating.
You commit to an environment, a process, a methodology almost that actually pair bonding is a good thing for society, and etc. etc.
Yeah, but also that your relation is also a relation with God, that there's almost like a triangle,
Which gets you through the difficult times, quite frankly.
right? But in the absence of, I think, a higher purpose that a lot of people don't feel, why would people be motivated to get married? If people are thinking, well, it's just because, oh, I get a tax break, or maybe my children should have a well, it's better if there's a contract involved. And I'm not saying those marriages don't work or that people aren't loyal and committed and loving and so on, but there is a qualitative difference between a religious marriage ceremony, and a secular civil marriage.
You're right, but if any policy wonks are listening, we would appreciate government nudge also because that can make a difference. There are countries that, for example, if you've had 4 children, you don't pay any more income tax. because actually you've created four more taxpayers for the future generation. We'll let you off for now.
Well, indeed, I've been to Hungary and indeed to a conference on family formation in Budapest about a year ago, and which was fascinating. It was amazing. It brought together all of the most interesting people in the world who work on demographics and marriage and children. Um, and yes, Hungary has managed to cut the divorce rate in half, um, among other things. You know, the demographic rate is growing but slowly. It's difficult, partly because people are getting married later, which seems to be the major thing. And so a lot of people are having not as many children as they would like.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. It's the marrying young thing which we've lost. Which and you've got a there are it's a very complex reason, or many complex reasons why that's happening, but the greatest of which is just essentially we're all sheep, and so we just follow each other, and if people aren't marrying young, well, you won't marry young, and so it's how you kind of change that flywheel effect, which is a big thing. You mention in your book, you mention respect, that one thing men want is respect, and one reason why they're often found in prison is because of their involvement with gangs. And you talk about the fatherlessness epidemic, and actually that, you know, the research would say, well, they're looking for substitute fathers and respect that they haven't got in gang culture, etc., etc., etc. But I'm minded of a book I read by Shaunti Feldon, who's a US kind of marriage writer, for women only. And she then wrote a follow-up for men only. I've interviewed her actually. And she says, look, there are these things that women just don't get about men. And I read it with my wife. We kind of read it together. And my wife was saying, is that true? And I was saying, yeah, of course it's true. Whoa. That's weird. I never realised that. And loads of interesting stuff like that, which is quite. But respect was one of the things, and you highlight this in your book, that men, they want to feel, and again, it's terribly stereotypical, and I get that. But on a population basis, it seems to be that women want to know they're going to be loved and protected no matter what. Yep. Whereas men don't bother with that. They want to know that they have worth. They have significance. There's a point to them existing. And a really good way of getting that is in a marital relationship, you know, where you're with somebody who says, yeah, I'm happy to depend on you. It might not be financially, it might not be, but actually, thank you for being there. Thank you for being you. And just the word thank you, I really appreciate you. A comment like that can transform a man's life. Nobody knows. I go around the country doing loads of kind of marriage enrichment stuff, and little things like that will have men in tears and wives saying, I just didn't realize, you know. And you touch on it in the book, and it's so important.
No, I think you're right. And I mean, we should all be grateful for many reasons. I think living in
Yeah.
gratitude, however you want to put it, and being grateful for the gift of life and so on is part of the
Mm,
bigger
mm,
picture.
mm.
And a lot of people don't feel like that. A lot of people feel resentful and nihilistic and so on.
Yep,
And the culture
yep,
does very little
yep,
to stop them from feeling
yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but yes, I completely agree. I think there's something, you know, and again talking broadly, but I think there are truths here, like that men need to act in the world, you know, in a way that women do not, and they need to see their action reflected back. And it's not that women don't act, or it's not that they aren't worldly, but I think there is a sort of adventure spirit in men. There is something about having to do something meaningful and to be seen to be doing it and to be recognized in that doing, making, thinking, creating, whatever it is, fixing that um, is absolutely core to masculinity of all kinds.
And it's not to say, because again, people just want to say, oh, well, because there are exceptions, there can therefore be no rules. And I think that's a fallacy throughout society, you know? We shouldn't say because there are exceptions, there are therefore no rules. The exception proves the rule. You know, there's maybe, if you look at the evidence around trait differences between men and women, there's maybe a 30% overlap, you know? So there are some women who are stronger than some men. But at the extremes, all the strong people are men. let's not mess about.
And I think in situations of really quite advanced equality like Sweden, they've run experiments where they've opened STEM up to women, and actually fewer women than even in less equal countries want to do STEM. That's not to say there aren't the odd woman who does engineering and science. I mean, I'm quite masculine in terms of my interests. Personally, I was a tomboy. Philosophy is very male dominated. I enjoy things that are quite masculine, albeit sort of slightly arts and humanity-ish. Um, and that's uh, but that doesn't make me not a woman, and it doesn't make me rather womanly in other ways, right?
Yeah. So before we move on to your transition, if you like, it's
Mm.
I'd recommend people read the book. It's very current. It kind of captures everything. It's a digestible book. I read it this morning again before our interview. So it's you can read it fairly quickly,
It's
and it
mercifully short.
but it's a good read, and there's a lot in it. It's not unreferenced. There's a lot in it. If you were going back again, and you kind of alluded to this earlier on, and I won't spoil all the stuff in the book because I think people should go and buy it and read it. But if you were going back again, what would you write differently? What would you add that you hadn't added, or something else?
Well, I mean, it's not that old as you say. I mean, I
Hmm.
think one of the I mean, it got reviewed quite well
It
in
did.
quite a few places, and
It
most of
did.
the reviews are very positive. I think one thing that some friends said to me was that that I don't quite understand how dark male desire can be sometimes, and I think probably women do struggle with that. And I think part of the reason I didn't go into the darkness in some ways was because the book is also aspirational. I wanted it to be a bootstrapping book for both men and women who read it because I wanted to say, look, we can all be better. I mean, it's a bit like saying we're all sinners. We all are able to commit sin, but we also have a choice, right? So I wanted to say this is why the theme of goodness is so important in the book. But I'm not just saying, oh, it's only up to men to be better. It's also up to women too. It's up to all of us, right? So there was a sort of decision to make it a kind of moral heuristic, if you like, rather than
Hmm.
dwell in horror, which can be itself quite seductive. But I think one of the fair criticisms of the book was that it didn't go into how actually profound male sexual desire can be, especially in a very sexualized culture, and actually how much men have to sort of learn to live with their desire, right?
You're absolutely right, and it's funny because there's a couple of slides immediately come to mind when I go around doing the marriage stuff, and one is I talk about how men might prefer sex in the morning, a woman might prefer sex in June. And that always makes everyone laugh because it's like, oh my goodness, yeah. And occasionally the couples are actually the opposite way round, and which is interesting. But generally speaking, that's the case. A man would love to have sex multiple times a day. It's just simply not the case for a woman. It's generally speaking, it's completely different. And then you mentioned the other key point. I can't remember who was it that said, "Every man is like the moon. He has a dark side that nobody ever sees."
Mm.
Yeah, and one of my other slides has got kind of pictorial representations, generally speaking, of men and women, and the man is just this concrete data center, kind of featureless concrete data center, and the point is, you don't want to go inside there. It's most men are living with struggles and trials and all sorts of things going on with their mind that they never share because often the women that they're living with couldn't take it if they shared it, in all honesty. And then there's this concept that there are demons inside. Your book makes it quite clear that all of us are a combination of good and bad, but the real men are the men who've realised that and have got those demons under control. Almost like the Jordan Peterson thing, of that you're supposed to be a controlled monster, and that's the integration of the real masculine.
Yeah, and women have their struggles too, I mean, it's I think they're different, but I think we can help each other would be the point. And this is why I've sort of also concluded that, monogamous marriage between a man and the woman is the best way of fettering desire and containing sexuality and in a way that doesn't kill it either, that actually embraces the reality of sexual desire on both parties. It doesn't mean that people don't have to compromise. It doesn't mean that you always get what you want, but it's for a higher purpose, right?
And that commitment to something greater than
Yeah.
yourselves means, well, we're stuck together. We may as well try and work this out.
Yeah.
You know, as opposed to the alternative, which is, well, I'll, cohabitation, I'll stay with you for as long as you don't annoy me or until I find somebody better.
Right.
It's not as good a proposition, which is why the data says the results, generally speaking, aren't as good in terms of adults or for children. And one other line, which you just almost a throwaway line, which you mentioned in the book, which I loved, is that private lives are called that for a reason. As a society, we've kind of lost that because we teach children from a very young age all sorts of different sexual practices and what to do and what to expect. You know, and anecdotally, a third of all porn consumption is by girls looking for what's expected of them. Yeah. And so we've kind of lost that notion of private lives are called that for a reason. Sex is in the open now, and the only thing that matters is consent. Let's talk about it. Let's enjoy it. Let's have as much of it as we want to. I don't know if you remember writing that line. I'm just curious to probe a bit further.
No, sure. Well, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, it's sort of horrifying to think that these things are being discussed in schools for children. I mean, this is very bizarre. Like, what kind of world are we trying to create? I think that sex is not that important, and a culture that's dominated by sex has taken a wrong turn. You know, I am not saying it's not important, but it's not. I don't know. It has the wrong place in our world, and also the rules are very confusing. Like I say about Me Too and so on, it's like almost the entire culture encourages everyone to be sexual, but if you cross some invisible line or you make a mistake, you're sort of condemned forever because there's no forgiveness either, and there's no sort of nuance. It's just so, you end up with all kinds of I call it puritanical. The culture is puritanical, at once prurient and puritanical, right? So both extremely lascivious and sexualized, but also extremely judgmental. When you decide that someone has crossed the line or whatever.
Well, you mentioned the cartoon, didn't you? I think that with the cartoon that captured the two sides, one lady being an attractive man saying to an attractive lady, "You look nice today," and her saying, "Oh, thank you." And then the cartoon next door was an unattractive man saying to the lady, "You look nice today," and she's picking up the phone to HR.
Yeah, no, exactly. So there are all kinds of hypocrisies and things going on in the culture, which is not really truly sexually liberated. It's sexually liberated only insofar as it up to a point at which point then it becomes a kind of question of yeah, sort of prurience and condemnation. If you decide you don't like someone, usually for some other reason.
Great. Listen, the,
Yeah.
the book is good. Go and buy it. Go and read it, and then let us know what you think. And if you've got some key questions, well, we'll get Nina back to talk about it. But Nina, your transition. I shouldn't use the word transition these days. It means something completely different. your
Let's
your
reclaim it.
your
It's fine. From one
yeah,
state to
okay, yeah.
another.
Let's claim the word back
Yeah.
again. So your transition from kind of uh, left-leaning thinker on these issues to somebody who's kind of changed, and in fact, you're married yourself, and you've got a different attitude on it all now. If you're willing to, for a few minutes as we
Yeah.
close, talk us through that. That'd be lovely to hear.
Sure. I mean, so I think I was definitely on the old left, right? So I'd say I would like to defend some of what we were doing. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
whatever it
Back in
is
the
now
day,
was
yeah,
was
yeah,
I think people were
yeah,
preoccupied with issues of class and fairness and justice, and also about poorer people not being treated badly, and
yeah,
that
yeah.
I still have sympathy with some sort of blue labor projects and things like that.
Mm,
But I think yes, I mean I was brought up in a quite liberal way, like many people. No access to religion. I wasn't baptized. My parents, who did get married at 23, like everybody of their generation, they told me, this was the norm. And so my parents are in their late 70s now. So they were married in the 60s. Um, it They were nevertheless a big part of a kind of yeah, like hippie movement. They're very into sort of nature and so on. And I had a lovely childhood growing up in the countryside and, quite pagan. And the I suppose how do I put it? Like a lot of people realizing the limitations and the dark side of liberal individualism, I suppose. Like coming to understand that, particularly the left version of this, which sort of increasingly became about, well, do what you want, desire is good, you know, very few resources for dealing with any pathological behavior. Oh, well, that's just understandable because we live in this world, and of course, why wouldn't you be an addict? Why wouldn't you, do all these things? Because there's no kind of moral basis for disapproval, right? If everything is just predicated on the idea of, well, it feels good, or you're not harming anyone, probably, although you probably are, um, then it's okay. And yeah, I mean, then I think the left itself, what gets called the left, became extremely censorious. I think without a kind of anthropological or religious foundation, what it did was just reinvent various terrible forms of uh, social behavior, which include kind of mobbing and total lack of forgiveness and so on. And
Excommunication,
yeah, 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 yeah.
almost its own philosophical religion, really,
Yeah,
with its
so
high
like a
priests,
strange
etc.
fanatical cult,
Yep.
really, and particularly around issues of reality, so sexual difference. So,
Mm, mm.
like many people, I got kind of excommunicated over the sexual difference thing because I wasn't prepared to go along with it. I knew I would get some pushback. I didn't realize just how crazy some people are, unfortunately. But there you are, a lesson learned. Um, and then I think so increasingly I was, just um, I don't know, just my understanding of reality and of creation sort of deepened. I'd always been kind of like a panentheist in some ways, got quite Spinozist, God is nature, this kind of thing. So I thought that being was good, but I didn't really. I had absolutely zero uh relation to the church or any church whatsoever. And I mean, if you go to a normal state school in the 80s and 90s. I mean, your access to Christianity is extremely minimal. I mean, maybe a few Bible stories retold in
Yep.
a way that's quite
Yep.
humanistic,
Yep.
maybe a few hymns, but really the more like Beatles end of hymns, like nothing nothing that would demand anything of you, like just, oh, let's be nice to each other and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so on. So
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
had no
Yeah.
real understanding of organized religion at all, and I wasn't baptized, as I said. And then I think I met my husband actually during lockdown, and we started to go to church. So there was a church near us that was kept open during the
So how
lockdown.
just technically we met during lockdown?
Yes,
It's kind of like, well, you were locked down, so how did you meet?
well, indeed. So I I didn't agree with the
Without
lockdown.
without convicting yourself of a
No,
crime.
indeed. So I didn't agree with the lockdown policies. So
Yep.
I thought they were a gross authoritarian overreach, and so I carried on doing things in lockdown, like I
Right.
or put on a play and
Yep.
things like that. Anyway,
And you met a kindred spirit. It sounds like.
well, yes, yes. So in any case, but a friend of ours who is also a priest kept his church open, again in all seriousness, against the law, against the guidance of the church. And he was public about this afterwards, so I'm not betraying any confidence. But and I think going to church during this period gave me an entirely new conception of reality and of the world, and the world against the world, if you like, the sort of the world of Christianity outside the world as conceived by the bureaucrats and the politicians and the sort of prison image that they have. It's very difficult to explain. It's difficult to explain one's conversion process, but I think there were a whole series of things that happened, some of which are harder to talk about than others, but an increasing feeling of being drawn into the church and the correctness of the church.
Mm,
And also,
mm,
I think the experience of having been ostracized, mobbed, and cancelled, including by friends of mine, caused a sort of spiritual crisis, which was partly a revaluation of everything that is worldly, right? So, what does it mean to have a job? What does it mean to have status? What does it mean to, so questioning of all of those things. And then coming out of that the other side and accepting really this kind of fundamental brokenness in me, and in everybody else, seeing that rather than this black and white, oh, you're good, we're good, you're bad, that kind of thinking, and the mobbing, which is perennial
Oh,
anthropological
goodness me.
feature and
Yeah.
indeed is central in Christianity. The concept of the mob, the scapegoat, is what Christianity is in it. It's totally about this. And so I think by analogy, then understanding that we killed Christ, that humanity will kill even the person without sin, and that this is a fundamental feature of how human beings can behave, but they also cannot behave like that. And Christianity is in the solution to that problem, right?
In fact, not even kill the person without, but especially the person without sin,
Well,
because
yes,
because he's such a contrast to us, and it's so annoying.
right. So I think it was the fact that Christianity is correct, that it's right, that and that this is something we have to accept about ourselves and to accept that in me, that I'm capable of that. I'm capable of being the mob. We all are. That's why we rehearse it at Easter. And, I suppose shifting my understanding of the world, revaluing the world, not as a place of acquisition or whatever social love, but or fake love, but rather a place that is in many ways a dark place, but also a place that has been created by us that has all of these possible traps and snares. You know,
Very interesting. Yeah. So your almost your philosophical views were were changed at the same time as your faith views, or did one influence the other? Do you think, or
yeah, they were happening at the same time, I suppose. I think I would say that.
which kind of makes sense, I suppose.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, congratulations on being married. Well done. That's fantastic news. Do you have any more books inside you waiting to burst
Well,
out?
yes, I'm trying to work on a proposal for a book about the family. I want to write like a strange history of the family, um, or something like this. But I have to say, honestly, being rather self-critical, but truthfully self-critical, I have procrastinated and I need to get on with it. So, Tony, please tell me to write my proposal.
Nina, get on with it. But you've done. I mean, you've written two books, so you know how to do it,
Yeah,
right?
but like
Um,
they're both really short and they were like
yeah,
years
yeah.
apart. So,
Yeah, I always say to people, I'm not writing four books because there's
come on.
definitely four I should write. My wife keeps saying, just get on with it. And you think, when do you want me to get on with this? Which part
I
of the
know. But
the
you
two
but you
minutes every
have a
six
you
months
have
I have free?
children, you have jobs. I spend my whole life just sort of standing on the balcony looking at
Oh
birds.
no, no, no. Well, perhaps we need to just motivate each other somehow. We'll talk about that separately. But Nina, and as soon as you've made progress with that, come and talk to us again because you're a fascinating individual. Really grateful for the book. Keep up the great work, and look forward to speaking to you again, Nina Power. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony.